All right, greetings from the Dark Continent. Conscious Caracal here, or Adams Van Sail, here to shine a light on the goings on very down south here on the Dark Continent of Africa. Tonight, I'm joined by a guest that you all will recognize if you're a regular on this channel. I think it's almost your 10th appearance now here, Rob. So I don't think you need an introduction at this point, but I'm looking forward to it. We're talking about your bread and butter topic, the Cape, and its significance, not just domestically, but also abroad. And you wrote a very good and excellent piece recently on it, and we're going to be delving into the content of that. Welcome back.
Yeah, hello. Nice to be back.
All right. So, Rob, maybe before we get into some of the main meat and potatoes of this conversation, why do you keep just writing about the Cape? Why is this your infatuation? Why is your obsession? Let's just get a little refresher for the audience there. Why is this your driving force and topic?
Well, I mean, look, my family's lived in this particular town for 300 years. And, I feel at home in the Cape. I mean, look, I've seen much of the rest of the country. And while I used to think of myself as South African in the broader sense, I think it was particularly university experience that sort of made me realize that there's certain ethnic tensions in the country, racial tensions in the country that make it long term not a feasible project, because the country goes through sort of very deep, unstable waves. Particularly when you look at it historically, you go through these big sort of cycles of instability and ethnic tension, and the consequences are that people sort of victimize one another. Our people as well have done it, so it's not news to anyone. And I think that, in order to actually function, you need to have some kind of common culture. You need to have some kind of balance of sort of ethnicities in terms of their size and their power that allows them to defend themselves institutionally in the country. And I think that in the long term, look, there's not enough white people, there are not enough colored people, there are not enough Indian people to defend themselves within South Africa broadly in the long term. And but they are in the Cape. And in the Cape, there's also that whole element of most people speak Afrikaans. Most people have a sort of affinity for certain Western institutions, a fuzzy affinity, I should say, because we're not like the Netherlands or Spain or anything, but there's a sort of general feeling that kind of the Cape is different from the rest of the country. So, and at a certain point, I sort of noticed the Cape independence movement while I was sort of feeling a very broad sense of despair at the larger picture, and something clicked into place for me. So, and after a while, once I actually started getting involved with the people in the movement, not that I'm a big part of it or anything, but once I sort of started to put a bit of personal effort into it, you feel sort of like a consciousness shift where you stop identifying with the broader country and you think of yourself as being of the Cape, not being of South Africa. And so that's kind of what happened to me. And so when I look at the news, I don't think, okay, what's happening in South Africa? I think, well, what's happening that affects the Cape? That's just how I naturally think about it. And I imagine that people who feel a great loyalty to the king in Zululand will probably have a similar sort of perspective on issues, even if they're not necessarily separatists. So it's more sort of like it's more of an attitude thing. Like I write about the Cape because that's where I'm from. It's my country, and South Africa's as we learned very we learned very thoroughly when we were getting all those decolonial education lectures. South Africa is a colonial construct, and I mean it's true. I mean you have to give the left their credit when they notice something that's real. And yeah, so that's sort of where I stand. And
Yeah, there's a lot of unintentional truth often in the analyses of leftists. You find this type of there's a little bit of truth in the bedrock, but they don't even know that it's there. I was actually thinking just the other day when you were talking now about your identity as a Kaapenaar. I was
yeah,
thinking the other day just about. I mean, I grew up in the Cape. I spent 23 years of my life there, and just the other day I thought now. All those years growing up, I didn't really realize I was growing up within such a specific, unique context. I always thought about
yeah,
just I was growing up in South Africa. This is the South African growing up experience. This is the town that I grew up in the Western Cape. Malmesbury is just like any other town, South African town. And then you realize
mm,
no, it's a particularly Cape town, and the Western Cape is a specific, unique province, and the type of surroundings, the environment. I mean, you can go on. There's the environment, the different environment. There's the different cultures. There's the different political situation. There's the different language makeup of the population. There's the differences just stack up in regards to the
mm,
Western Cape in regard compared to the rest of the country. And you don't realize it if you've spent your entire life there. You just take it for granted and think the Western Cape is just another province, another economic zone within the bigger South African empire. But then once you spend some time outside of the Western Cape, as I have, you start realizing the differences once you've only been able to really get the contrast in. So that's, I think it adds to what you've also been saying. I think the Cape independence movement that you very strongly support, and anyone that's fighting for any form of autonomy or independence for the Western Cape, I think that whole idea of the Cape identity, what type of identity is at the very center of the
mm.
province or the region, that's going to be a critical question. It's not just something you can brush off and say, well, everyone, whether you identify with the Cape or not, and that's the end of that debate. No, I think there's going to be
Yeah.
a lot of focus on specifically those questions of identity.
Yeah, look, I mean, I don't want to bullshit people. I mean, I know a lot of other people in the movement tend to have this thing of like, oh, well, the Cape is this cohesive thing, and like, I do think we exaggerate that a bit. I think, look, we have to admit the obvious that there are divides over here, and it's sort of this very sort of messy, complex thing. But there's sort of like a blurry gradient between different communities. Which isn't true of the rest of the country, where the lines between different communities are very hard, except in like the upper reaches of the upper classes, where you start to see a bit of crossover. But it's like the way that I look at it is, if you're going to try and make any kind of sort of nation state work in South Africa, what are you going to do with the Cape? It does have its own sort of cultural continuum, and there are a lot of common elements that people can sort of feel and see. There's sort of broad political preferences. There are broad sort of cultural preferences, religious preferences. And I mean, one of the things is it's one of the few places in the world that sort of Muslims and Christians actually get on with each other without any major beef, which I think in its own is quite impressive. But I don't want to be one of these guys who thinks that, if we get independence, then it's going to all be roses. I mean, this is one of the things that, okay, enough from you, boy. I I think it's one of the things that, like, people who have any of these political projects keep forgetting is, like, things aren't taken care of when you're independent. I mean, look at Brexit. I mean, they got out and then the government didn't change anything, and so all of the problems just kept getting worse. They didn't use that independence to do anything with it. And if we don't sort out the problems that exist here in the Western Cape once we get independence, well, then they're going to get deeper, and we can easily see the same problem that South Africa has had, where you get majority ethnic populism versus you sort of minoritarian lager mentality and so on. That's an easy sort of bad future to end up in. So I don't want to say, like, everyone who's thinking of this that it's, I have a utopian bent here, but I do think it's our only actual chance, because otherwise it's like, okay, well, cleave to your racial group and sort of hide out, hide away behind your muskets. And I do not like that future. I mean, I like my sort of cozy little, quasi-civilized existence, where I can,
Mm.
walk barefoot to the shops and don't have to put burglar bars on the windows. So,
Yeah, and before we get to the specifically the importance of the Cape within the global context and to the West specifically, I think we should rather start first at the past and where not all this started, but where a lot of what's going on today comes from. And Adams Roots, my colleague, has actually made the point that if you look at history, South Africa or Southern Africa at many times in the past has been a infatuation of the world. I mean, you look at just examples in no particular order. The Anglo-Boer War, the entire Europe is infatuated with the war. A lot of nation states are taking the side of the Boers. The war has a massive effect on the prestige of the British Empire as well. You've got in the previous century, you've got apartheid from 1948 to 1994, also a massive talking point globally. Everyone knows about South Africa when it comes to that specific political issue. And you've got many examples other than that. I mean, there's also the gold rush. There's also a lot of exciting stuff going on here. But specifically within that context, can you add a little bit of context of the past significance of Southern Africa in the global context and to the West specifically in the zeitgeist that was reigning at the time before we get into the present and the future?
Well, I don't think that the thing is that the things that make the past make South Africa important in the past are kind of the same things that make it important in the present. So there's not a huge difference. I mean, the oldest sort of geopolitical feature was the Cape, and because that until we discovered diamonds and gold and all of those shiny things.
Excuse me, Robert. Professor Milan calls it the Vasco da Gama epoch, the first significant focus on the southern tip of Africa specifically.
Yeah, I mean, it's just about shipping, really. I mean, like old-fashioned shipping, it takes months to get around the Horn of Africa, so you need to stop off here and get fresh water and hopefully some fresh produce. I've got a big soft spot for golden age of sail and so on. And I mean, I've always loved the C.S. Forester's novels. I've read every single one of them. And when you look at what life on one of those ships is like, and you think, the difference between sailing around South Africa, sailing around to India with or without the Cape of Good Hope to stop at, it's chalk and cheese, really. It's so that's the main thing. But I mean, even in the present, it kind of makes a difference. I mean, we're not a huge port of trade for international trade the way that the Suez Canal is, or the Straits of Malacca or something like that. But I think increasingly now that we're entering one of these big pivotal moments, we've got China, who has managed to get South Africa and Egypt sucked into their sort of BRICS program. And I mean, people look at BRICS and they say, well, what is that? Well, I mean, there's like a whole cluster of different institutions like the China Development Bank and so on, Shanghai Development Organization, things like that, which people sign on to. And there's sort of like a gradual integration and sort of checking whether they comply with stuff, And, once China's got both Egypt and South Africa, they've got control of all of the west to east traffic, That's a really big deal. So, kind of important. And it sort of means that the West will have to start paying attention to South Africa a bit more. And I think they've taken it for granted that South Africa's sort of on their side for reasons I can adumbrate later. But I mean, the other obvious sort of big thing is, gold and minerals. So the reason, I mean, this is sort of 101 stuff. But I mean, the big thing that people miss is it's only obvious when you look at a map, when you look at maps a lot. And that's that, all the mineral fields, with an exception again that needs mentioning in a bit, with the exception of the new discovery of rare earth minerals in the Cape. all of the minerals that are of any importance are deep in the interior. So let's say you look at South Africa before unification. You've got a couple of blue republics that have got some nice deposits. You've got a little bit of a deposit in the northern part of the Cape Colony. And for the most part, all of the good, tasty stuff is behind boundaries of these independent republics, which is, it's a great source of revenue if you can get your hands on it. But then you're also dependent on the prices you can get at the various ports. And if you're going
to have to construct a massive railway system as well.
Yeah. And so, I mean, when you got unification, this still proved a problem. Like the 10 years between the war and the unification, or was still sort of a trade confederacy. So there were sort of trade wars that were going on and off between Transvaal, Natal, and the Cape, where everybody's trying to either undercut or squeeze one another. And in 1908, there was a big problem, a huge sort of, it sort of became an open trade war when Transvaal basically threatened to export all of their minerals through what's now Maputo, Delagoa Bay. And, that's run by the Portuguese, not the British. Big problem. So that triggered the British to call for a conference of unification. And the second the question is proposed, then you have the ethnic question coming in, because Afrikaners who had managed to win representation in all of the republics except Natal, and then Natal wanted the Union to support their military efforts against the Zulu. They were quite sort of reckless and over-aggressive. But the big problem over here was the British wanted it because it allows them to have control of the minefields at lower cost of transport, access to more labor, the ability to import huge numbers of British settlers. And then the Afrikaans wanted it because, demographic majority, you're sure to win the vote. And so it's both of these centrifugal and centripetal forces that just sort of brought it together, because there was no one with any power who saw an interest in keeping it apart.
Well, I think the first point that you touched on is one of the most important points in my view when it comes to the geopolitical significance of the Cape and South Africa at large. But let's focus on the Cape, because that was the topic of your piece. And that reason, I think, specifically is resources. And I think many people on the outside looking in, and many people even in South Africa, don't know the vast amounts of resources that South Africa is still sitting on. There's this almost common idea that we've depleted all the major resources, but there's some massive deposits still here. I mean, I think we are one of the biggest exporters of platinum. In Afrikaans, it's mangaan. I don't know what it's in English.
Manganese.
Yes, manganese. A lot of critical metals used in electronics. I've
got a little paragraph. I've got a little paragraph of stats that I can read to you. Let me see. Platinum.
I can see it in my mind's eye, and I know it's there.
Oh, sure, but I opened the wrong tab. Substack.
While Rob is looking for the
there we go
piece, just for anyone that wanted to know, there is a link to this piece that we are referencing constantly in the description. You can go read it after the stream.
Yeah. Okay, so this is from Wits University, because they got a mining institute. So on their front page, they've got a whole bunch of stats. So I just sort of took out a bit of the waffle and just condensed all the stats into one paragraph, and it says 16 commodities ranked in the top 10 internationally. South Africa has the largest reserves of platinum group metals at 88% of global reserves, 80% of manganese reserves, 72% of chromite reserves, 13% of known gold reserves in the world. It's ranked second in titanium minerals, having 10% of the global share, zirconium at 25%, vanadium at 32%, vermiculite at 40%. We're the biggest exporters of vermiculite in the world. It helps that our deposits do not coincide with asbestos, which is often found together with it. And we've got 17% of the world's fluorspar. So in addition, the country contains 17% of the antimony reserves. So then there's the other aspect, which is production, because I mean your proven reserves and how much you're chucking out is not the same. So we produce 60% of the world's platinum group metals, 25% of vanadium, 39% of ferrochrome, 60% of the world's aluminosilicates, 35% of the world's vermiculite, as I said, 32% of the world's zirconium, 19% of the world's titanium, 17%. I mean, it goes on. So I mean, yeah, it's
But
it's
that's
just
the South African context specifically. That's those stats are
yeah.
in South Africa at large. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, look, the reason the Capes become important is I mean, it's really just because of the recent sort of geopolitical pivot. I mean, if we still were living in like the unipolar world of the 1990s, it would be a different story. But at the moment, we've got sort of a Marxist government in power who have very, very close ties with China. So they have, I mean, there's a special sort of training school that they send most of their cadres to, or cadres, as they like to pronounce it. And they basically sort of learn a lot of their government strategy from China. And so some of the first things that Cyril Ramaphosa proposed as reforms when he became president haven't come to pass yet. They're still sort of stewing on the agenda. One of the big ones is something called the district development model. And the idea behind this is to sort of centralize governance in the way that sort of China and Soviet Russia did. So you bring all of the different spheres of government together, and you develop each region separately, like over here you're going to produce lumber, over there you're going to manufacture cars, over there you're going to do this. And the idea is that you integrate every aspect of governance centrally so that it's all cooperative, but basically what it means is the ruling party babysits everyone down to the floor.
Right. But it also locks those different zones into the central model because they can't break away. You can't, for example, let's say your zone just specializes in raw iron. You can't really build an economy if your entire zone's economy is just built on manufacturing iron products or refining iron.
Yeah, no, it's true. But I mean, there's a commonality in thinking, and then there's that the traditional allegiance with Russia. Russia basically coordinated the ANC strategy for nearly 15 years.
It's just what really just I find ridiculous about that is the fact that I don't know if it's an act or theatrics, but it seems like the West is just completely naive to the entire ANC allegiance to the East and Russia in particular. They always seem shocked and astounded when anything happens, almost as if they are blown off their feet when we do military drills with Russia or do some type of trade deal with China. Is it just theatrics? Is that the face that they have to put up, or is it actually that they are just unaware?
I think it's just the way they look at the world is very materialist. So they'll say, okay, well, we have, the bulk of your trade is with the United States and Western Europe. Your biggest source of foreign direct investment is the United States. So they go, oh, there's no way that clearly they're friendly. And when we see them at the conferences, they all believe in diversity and inclusion and all kinds of stuff.
Pursuing that green agenda with our rolling blackouts. I mean, we hit those green those green goals. We're well on our way for our 2025 green and environmental goals with the 12 hours of electricity blackouts a day.
Plus, I mean, there's that whole thing of the whole point of South Africa is ending white privilege, and it's it's to be against that in any way is really sort of anyone would take that as a sign of racism. So it plays into sort of the prestige moral ideology in the West. So and in a broader sense, it's South Africa is really sort of like a little world state. You got Asians and Europeans and Africans living cheek by jowl, happy clappy. Everybody loves one another, rainbow, this, that, and the other. And so the idea that this couldn't work is a blow to everyone's moral aspirations and everyone's political ambitions in the West. Because, I mean, the idea for a long time it's been United States is going to be the sole global power and create a harmonized global system and break down, barriers and everything like that. So, if it doesn't work, it's putting a stake through the heart of the beast. So that they can't really bring themselves to criticize the system we've got, because otherwise, because then they've got to go actually, like, affirmative action and diversity, equity, inclusion, all of that's bad and stupid, and actually multiculturalism doesn't work, and actually sort of all of this compassionate sort of wealth redistribution stuff doesn't work either. That's very scary for the bulk of people who are educated in the West. So they can't bring themselves to really substantively critique. And you'll notice it in our own media as well. You're not going to get
what's that saying? That's saying the South African commentariat are just temporarily embarrassed Americans.
Didn't you come up with that one?
No, I've noticed the American tendencies, but that's not directly my quote. No,
but I don't think the thing is, I think it's ever so slightly inaccurate, because they're copying the way Americans think, but they don't think they're copying Americans. Because the thing is, the prestige position is to hate America, and no one hates America more than Americans. So I think it's sort of what they're copying America more than they would like to admit. So there's a lot of paradoxes there. But I mean, what it means is, like, okay, so they look at they've got these ideological blinkers on, and then the other ideological blinkers are they look at things in terms of material stuff. So they think, trade's going on, but China's moved up to being our biggest export target, and I think our biggest import partner as well. And Russia sort of doing better in Ukraine than they're supposed to be doing is, I'm not saying they're exactly doing as well as they should given what they've got, but they're doing better than a lot of commentators estimated. I think what it is, it's like everyone sees, here's a moment where America's shown weakness. And it's true. I mean, the big reason for that is that America was unwise about how it applied its sanctions. And so it basically scared everyone into thinking, well, actually, no, we need to find a way out of the dollar system and outside of the SWIFT system, or we're all going to be fish in a barrel for American bullying. And so everyone's moving to de-dollarization. I mean, look at Saudi. It's made it one of its number one economic priorities, beyond sort of economic diversification and import substitution and things like that. They're focusing on de-dollarization. So how do we make sure that most of our imports are not in dollars?
Yeah, but let's pause on that point specifically, and bring it back to the Western Cape within that context of de-dollarization.
But this is the thing: is this particular in this particular moment, that whole move against Russia has sort of polarized the world. De-dollarization is part of it. And the thing is, what it indicates is that everyone sees this as not a normal moment of American sort of tussling with another country. They see it as a pivotal moment. So you see what happened with our government is we publicly said, we're remaining neutral. And in the meantime, we have a big cocktail party at the Russian embassy.
Right.
Now, everyone says, like, okay, well, that's sort of silly, chummy nonsense. But what they actually were having it about is they were raising their glasses to the end of American global hegemony. And that's really key here, because now America gets to watch South Africa drifting eastward. And like all of those minerals we mentioned, the thing is, not all of them are essential, and we aren't the only source of them. But if we sort of end up in a situation where we're no longer trading with the West, or we're trading less with the West, it'll dramatically raise the cost of doing business. And most of the owners of the mines over here are Western companies. So if the ANC decides tomorrow to strike a deal where they'll nationalize the mines and then subcontract running them out to China, there goes the whole sort of resource base, a lot of Western manufacturing. And yeah,
just a quick point there, Rob. Have you looked into how many, not the exact numbers, but are a lot of those resources that you mentioned in your piece located within the Northern and Western Cape? Or how does that distribution look?
No. So what's different about the Western Cape is that, our two main minerals resources here are almost entirely untapped. So that's because they're relatively new. I mean, no one needed uranium in the 19th century. No one really needed it until, the middle of the 20th century. So it's within living memory that uranium becomes of any importance.
Right.
And then the other one is rare earth minerals, which are almost useless until, a couple of decades ago.
Northern Cape has massive manganese deposits. I know those trucks that are carrying those manganese loads are destroying the highways going through the Northern Cape. Specifically, one of the roads that goes through Orania. That's actually how I know.
Right. So that whole sort of rail versus road thing is a thing I've had to be under my bonnet for a long time. But story for another time. The issue with the Cape is that what happened in this moment where Pretoria decided to go pro-Russian, and everyone's been reading the news recently, like, oh, okay, well, Simon's Town ship rocks up, a whole bunch of missiles get on the boat. Probably either from Denel, because they're the only ones that I could sort of pick up in my research are capable of manufacturing that, because Arms Corps does sort of Western-oriented stuff that isn't compatible.
A lot of their stuff is not going to be compatible,
Yeah, and then so it's either Denel or it's something imported from elsewhere that's passed through South Africa. Hard to tell.
Someone else made the point that it's likely also military electronics that could be going through on such as one ship, not specifically.
I doubt it. If you were looking for military electronics, you go to Iran, but I think it's munitions. I think that's the guess. That's the sort of educated guesses I'm getting from people. I'm not a military expert, so don't take me as an authority on this. But so there's a lot of heat, and it's been going on for a couple of years now because, well, not for a couple of years, for like more than a year, but not a couple of years. Because historically, South Africa's had this balance between, okay, we do some military sort of games we do war games with the East, and we do some war games with the West. We don't do war games with pariah states like Iran, but all of that changed after the Donbass war, because now you've got games with Iran, and they're canceling regular war games with America. So they took that hint really strong. I beg your pardon. And what happened is that the DA, Democratic Alliance, the Liberal opposition, who run the Western Cape,
the Western Cape,
they started signaling very hard. They started signaling very, very hard. We are pro-Ukraine. We are pro-West. Did a huge tour of like all of the
their leader to visit Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, the big one for me is actually not the Ukraine visit, because that's more of a media stunt. The big one for me is actually Steenhuisen visiting Chatham House, and the U.S. Embassy hosting a whole rotating cavalcade of sort of opposition parties. So they also had a big gala event with Gayton McKenzie, of all people. So the way I see it is they started. They were. I mean, this is looking at the sort of sort of research end of regime change activism. Yeah. And before then, during the COVID lockdown, Alan Winde, who's the premier for the province, he organized. Now he folded up the remnants of a slightly dodgy sort of local government outfit called the Knysna Tourism Board. The dodgy aspects of it, I think, are not something I'll get into over here, but he folded them up into something called Westgrow. Now, Westgrow is like it's an investment platform for promoting trade deals in the Western Cape. And they organized they did really good work. They organized PepsiCo's buyout of, I think it was Pioneer Foods.
It was Pioneer.
Foods, yeah, right. So it's a lot of our brands. So and a lot of things that used to be government made as well. So like Bacomo and Tasco and a whole bunch of things are now.
I know it's Pioneer because my father keeps ranting about the fact that we're selling all our food production out to foreign interests.
Right, so it's Alan Windy who organized that. He also organized as part of that trade deal as well, and it's a trade deal just with the Western Cape. It's really peculiar. So the United States did a trade deal not with South Africa but with the Western Cape, with one province. And in exchange, we got a whole bunch of medical aids, tuberculosis, COVID, all of that. We got a fiber deal to connect Cape Town with New York. And in return, we allowed all of the big sort of tech companies that are plugged into the CIA through what's called the Enduring Security Framework. All of them get to build special head offices in Cape Town. So if you've been following that ridiculous sort of debate with, well, it's not that ridiculous. It's just very sort of eccentric, typically South African eccentric stuff. Where Amazon's building a new headquarters on the Lisbech River, and one of the indigenous sort of tribal groups wanted to stop it, and then Amazon found their own indigenous tribal group that wanted it built, that kind of shit. And it got built anyway because property laws mean that if you're, especially over here, means if you're sneaky and you build while nobody's watching and you get your building past a certain level, then all of the usual checks and balances no longer apply and you get to finish the project, which is something that construction companies that have good relations with DA local governments get away with a lot. So they got, and they even did like a very peculiar little stunt where, and I'm sure you've seen this in other countries, where Facebook gets brought in and asked, "Why aren't you censoring the internet more?" It's a way of sort of transferring the agency and the culpability, so that they're being good boys instead of being. Anyway. Complicated.
No, the pivot is very clear. I mean, as I keep saying, the most simple way I can sum it up is they want to turn John Steenhuisen into John Guaido. Juan Guaido.
Yeah, Juan Guaido. But I mean, the thing about that is what the DA wants is they want backing to take Pretoria, which is, I mean, for a number of reasons is daft. Number one, so first of all, let's look at all the coalitions in all the metros that have existed up until this point outside of the Cape. The progress is very, very clear, and it's the same everywhere. The ANC screws up relentlessly until the point where they're actually threatening people's basic livelihoods, like water supply and things like that. And then eventually they give the DA a chance. And I mean, Nelson Mandela Bay is your textbook example. So that they get 21%, sorry, not 21, 46% of the vote versus the ANC's 39%. And they get in with a couple of little parties. And they can't really govern because the ANC sabotages the infrastructure, like literally hacking apart power lines and water pipes and things like that. And they use unions to destroy buildings, intimidate staff, all kinds of stuff. And then they pioneered a new way of rigging the tenders, which is that they used their deployed cadres in the legal department to tweak evergreen contracts to include as much stuff as they wanted. So they don't need to do any more tenders. They just tweak existing tenders going ahead so they can continue to loot even while they're out of government. So, this kind of stuff went on for a couple of years. Then the government, then they bribe one of the small parties and the government falls apart. And because of the chaos and the failure to deliver basic services, the voters stopped voting DA. They dropped down to parity with the ANC, 39-39. And so this has happened again. This is happening again in Gauteng. What happens to support for the DA after people experience what a coalition government looks like in South Africa? Well, they just dump the DA. They either go back to the ANC, or they stop voting, or they vote for like smaller parties. And the DA has failed to realize this. They keep thinking for some reason that the rest of the country is like the Cape. And so what you have is them playing hardball. Look at the coalitions now in Gauteng. What happens is either Helen Zille or her lapdog, Mr. Walters, walks into coalitions and says, okay, this is what you're getting. And if you don't like it, you can just have the ANC as government again. And then everyone goes, no, that's not how it works. And then they say, yes, it is exactly how it works. And you're just being uncooperative, and you're not being a team player, and you're betraying us. Very sort of a little hysterical language. So the consequences have been the coalitions just keep blowing up. I mean, also, the blame doesn't always lie on the DA. The Patriotic Alliance is also notoriously corrupt and completely ideologically nihilistic. And so, they don't. They're not a trustworthy partner, but they're also actually necessary to govern. And so there's a lack of realism about this.
Yeah. Just to
and
bring
it's going to
it,
be worse. What I'm saying is, it's going to be worse at a national level.
yeah.
Right.
To bring it back to the Western Cape specifically, there's one more point that you make in your piece that I think is absolutely critical, and I thought it was so critical that I made it the thumbnail of this stream, and that is specifically the shipping lanes, but specifically shipping lanes within the context of a multipolar world, where
Correct.
you have an Egypt that is aligned, not just Egypt being aligned with China increasingly so, but also, and you might have noticed this, the political realignment within the consolidation within the Middle East itself. I mean, we're seeing new Middle Eastern leaders visiting countries in the Middle East that they haven't visited in decades. There's an absolutely unprecedented realignment and consolidation going on there, and it's going towards in the direction of a more Eastern aligned bloc. What are the implications surrounding the Suez Canal of everything that I've just mentioned here?
Well, I mean, it's quite simple. So, look, I think most of this can be attributed to Mohammed bin Salman, who turns out to be one of them, just an extraordinary political genius. He doesn't.
For the audience that doesn't know, give us some context about his position in the world.
So he's the crown prince of Saudi Arabia, because his uncle has become too old to do the day-to-day governing. And his uncle's the current king, and it's an absolute monarchy. So, I mean, there's no checks on his powers. The only check on their power until now has been the clerics. So, your imams and what have you. But Mohammed bin Salman actually just put them away. I mean, I don't understand the internal politics, but he managed to put them away hard. So he's opening up the country massively to expats who can come in basically nearly tax-free. They're having raves. They're having sort of like K-pop stars coming in. They're opening up the country massively. And at the same time, they're having this sort of heavy, import substitution economics going on. So they're trying to move away from oil very rapidly. And at the same time, they're expanding their connections. They made peace with Iran. They made peace with Israel. They've made peace with Egypt. They made peace with Syria.
They're creating a Middle Eastern bloc.
Correct. So it's producing this bloc. But not only are they producing this bloc, they're moving that bloc towards China.
Absolutely.
So they say, okay, we're going to sell our oil in yuan now. And everyone goes, okay, well, oil's on its way out. Not so fast. I mean, it's still going to be a very, very important resource for decades to come. And that's just the way it is. And so once you're sucking this whole block in, Egypt gets to sort of negotiate its position over Suez, which is its only real bargaining chip on the international chessboard. Poker table is actually the better analogy here, but anyway. So if they get into a bind, or China wants to play hardball, they can just sort of close the Suez Canal to Western shipping or charge enormous tariffs on it. And then that leaves them, oh, okay, well, we're going to go around the Cape of Good Hope. I mean, shipping costs are a bit higher, but, whatever. Problem with that is now South Africa is part of BRICS and doesn't want to play ball anymore.
Welcome back to the 1960s, man.
Right. So, except it's worse. I mean, Russia didn't have South Africa.
So the 1860s, sorry.
Yeah, and the other thing you've got to remember is if you want to get minerals out of Congo, it's actually easier to ship a lot of stuff out of Katanga to get into the SADC and then out of the various ports there. So it's kind of important, but at the same time, now we've got Cape Independence Movement, right? So it's very little happens in the Cape that's sort of loud, shouty stuff in the streets for any cause. Like, nobody really likes getting out of bed for politics in the Cape. Very apathetic part of the world. But in terms of like polling support, and this is a part of the country where people don't like to agree on much, but Cape Independence seems to be getting enormous support. So like in the early stages of growth, we were getting support on the like heading towards 50% mark for Cape Independence. Now it's more likely stabilized at like around 60%ish, if I'm guessing. But again, this is, bear in mind, we don't have up-to-date data on where people are feeling. But we do know that the DA has been doing internal polling, and they have overwhelming support amongst their voters for Cape Independence. The leadership hates this. They absolutely hate this. And they want to crush the movement at all costs. But they can't do it in public because their supporters are pro-Cape Independence. So they've got to try and do workarounds to sort of get people's attention on Pretoria and say, well, we can take the union buildings. We're definitely going to win the 2024 elections. Nothing can go wrong there. Obviously, it can. But if you're the United States and you're looking at South Africa and you see this, okay, you've got an independence movement in the Cape. You've got ethnic tensions in Zululand. I mean, like the whole previous leadership battle has been over Zulu representation. But they've got their own culture. They've got their own king. They have a very sort of independent mentality. IFP is gaining, boatloads of votes in leading up to the following election. You're watching this, and Pretoria has decided that it's going east. It's friends with Russia. It's friends with China. You're going to lose access to all of these minerals. You're going to lose access to these shipping lanes potentially in the future. I mean, they don't have to actually do it. The fact that it's a bullet in the chamber for China and its allies is an enormous deal. If you're a serious American geostrategist, you look at this and you go, okay, well, what's the easiest way to ensure the long-term security of this stuff? Well, make South Africa a landlocked country, which is not going to be hard. You get the Cape to go independent, which you don't need much pressure. a couple million rand, not even dollars, a couple million rand in someone's campaign coffers.
The way the rand is depreciating at the moment, that's not going to be a struggle either.
That's cheap. That is cheap. You put a few million rand into Phil Craig's pocket, and you say diplomatically, we'll support you. The second you've got those two things, Cape Independence is in the bag. You don't really need support from Pretoria. You just need democratic support, international recognition, and the will to press the eject button. A similar thing goes for the Zulu, except that they're going to be extremely violent if they do it. I mean, we all know that. But the last piece of that puzzle would be, again, Delagoa Bay, Maputo, which we mentioned earlier. The thing about Maputo is they're already relying on American support to suppress a rebellion in the north that's being run by Islamist separatists. I mean, people call it, it's the Islamic State. It's Al-Shabaab. I mean, the thing is, once you get in that part of the world, it's kind of messy. It's an Islamist movement. And so you've got an American presence there. If America plays nice with them, does nice things for the Mozambican government, they can get cooperation for control of those ports. What you've got left is 60% of the internal trade in South Africa goes through Durban. Most of our iron ore comes out through Saldanha Bay, manganese as well. and then you've got the only part of the country that's growing at all leaving. You've got the biggest, you've got the most important trade port in the country leaving, and you've got your remaining option for exports in Maputo, sewn up by the Americans. If I was America, I would. It would take not even a decade. You break up South Africa, you encircle them, and you ensure that your the sort of international trade of essential minerals is secured. Your route around the Cape cannot be messed with by the Chinese. It's easy peasy, but no one's going to press that button while the Democrats are in charge, because for ideological reasons, and so so everything would rely on a Republican government coming into power in 2024, plus someone influential coming up to them and saying, "Hey guys, we need to play realpolitik in an aggressive way." I mean, like, you'd need Kissinger 2.0 to be whispering in their ears. I mean, who's like that now?
I see some people adding additionally. Debbie says Richards Bay, also a massive port. White Zulu says the same. And then Sideliner Opinion says PE and East London also have large ports.
PE and East London. I'm sorry, guys. Those ports as a percentage of our actual export is marginal. So, I mean, South Africa cannot survive on those ports. They cannot expand those ports. They'd have to make a really, really expensive loan to with a loan
and it's
deal
also
with China
going to take time.
I
mean, look at how it took them a decade to build Medupi Power Station, and then a week after it was built, a large part of it exploded.
Yeah, I mean, look, our ports are the lowest ranked in the world in terms of efficiency. The lowest. I mean, look, okay, America's got inefficient ports in San Francisco or whatever, but those are monsters. Those are monsters. Our ports are much smaller. They're tiny little things, okay, comparatively. And they're the most inefficient in the world, the most, all of them. So it's like, if you could imagine South Africa.
It's like comparing an inefficient car engine with an inefficient, like, little hand fan engine that you...
Yeah, and plus, I mean, you could literally bifurcate the country and geographically separating the Eastern Cape from the north, if you forced South Africa to recognize Lesotho, because Lesotho's made land claims as well. I mean, look, okay, Lesotho is meaningless in sort of power brokering sense, but they offer a sort of a good pretext, and if you hand them a big wad of cash and some international assurances, then they've got it. They take the Free State. You know what I mean? So there's all of these little things that are moving, that are sort of lying on the table if you want to play chess. And
but there's also
no one's moving. No one's moving. I mean, the thing that pisses me off, the DA has got this like huge cherry in front of them. It's like, okay, you can make history. You can guarantee. You can take
a moonshot at it.
You can take a moonshot. I mean, like, the thing is, they know that they've got like two options in front of them strategically in the long term. One, Cape Independence. Two, Moonshot Pact in Pretoria. The thing is, Moonshot Pact is almost guaranteed to fail because they do not know how to play politics at that level. I mean, do you understand, like, the complaint? There was an interview a while back where Helen Zille was complaining about the latest coalition collapse, and she was saying something like, we were manipulated, we were betrayed. I said, that's politics. You're whining about people playing politics like politicians. That just shows me that you're not equipped to actually negotiate power at the national level. And Helen Zille is the most shrewd member of the DA. She's clearly the most intelligent, clearly the most sort of ballsy, and I mean, honestly, the only serious strategist in the party. And if she's not up to that task, I mean, and I know I'm certainly not. If she's not up to that task, then what have we got left?
Rob, I actually want to put a graph on the screen that I saw today that I think will serve as a nice little intro to our last piece of discussion that we're going to be doing on this topic, and that's specifically how the Western Cape differs from the rest of the country. Now, this graph shows Yeah, this graph shows unemployment. Now, there's another stat that we can get into in regards to unemployment, in regards to where most is maybe a very weak word for it, where all the jobs have been created recently in South Africa.
Yeah, it was
But
99% of all new jobs in, what was it, Q3 or something of that fiscal
yeah,
year. And it was like 99% of all new jobs were in the Western Cape.
that
We,
1%. I mean, in the world of statistics, that's almost negligible. It's not even doesn't register.
yeah. And then in
Um,
construction, I mean, we dominate in construction. I mean, Gauteng is
mm,
the biggest economic hub in the country, and they've fallen
yeah,
behind us in terms of construction because you're having massive flight of minorities
mm,
and also skilled black people
mm,
moving to the Western Cape because this is where everything's happening.
yeah. So before we get to the other metrics, our friend Dwayne van Vieren shared this graph today. And he says here the latest SA unemployment data for the first quarter of 2023 just released. Western Cape beats all other provinces by just about every metric,
Mm.
not by a little, mind you, but by a lot, especially for expanded unemployment rate, including discouraged work seekers. So I'm just going to name a few of them if some of you are watching on a small screen and you can't see it. So I'm going to read the expanded because I think that's a lot more important than just the unemployment rate, because here you have discouraged workers as well. I think it's foolish not to use the expanded definition. So for
Yeah.
expanded definition, unemployment, you've got start with the Western Cape. You've got 25%, about 25.9%. Northern
Like
Cape,
Spain.
42%. Eastern Cape, 45%. Free State, 39.7%. Northwest, 54%. Gauteng, 39.6%. Limpopo, 48.6%. Mpumalanga, 49.7%. And KwaZulu-Natal, 47.3%. Let's just read that Western Cape one again, 25.9%. I mean, it's a massive gap. In regards to expanded unemployment rate in a country like South Africa, that's a major achievement. But as Dwayne points out in his tweet correctly, this large gap has been around for over a decade. So I think just one more point, Rob, before you jump in on these statistics and what this means for the Western Cape.
Mhm.
I think there's a critical difference or contrast that you have to keep in mind. That's Eastern Cape 45% versus Western Cape 25%. That's driving a lot of migration to the Western Cape, and that's going to put a lot of pressure on infrastructure, put a lot of pressure on communities. There's going to be a large swath of implications for the Western Cape coming in there. But also, yeah. So let's take it from there. What are your thoughts here on the unemployment? I mean, this is pretty much an indication of the economic performance of the province as well.
Yeah, look, it's pretty 101 stuff. I mean, if you can't maintain basic infrastructure, you can't maintain basic sort of administrative functionality, business can't work. So look, a little bit of an just to complicate the picture a little bit. One of the big things is we have half the country are on some form of welfare grants, and a lot of that is unemployment benefits. And the thing is, there are a lot of people who collect unemployment benefits and then get work under the table, either seasonally or, just spaza shop stuff or what have you. And so the unemployment stats in South Africa are not really indicative, but they are indicative of the size of the formal economy, which is the only part of the economy that we can actually tax. And we are headed to something of a fiscal cliff because the amount of taxpayers and the amount of tax collected is simply not keeping pace with the burden of paying for state-owned enterprises. Nobody wants to purchase. I don't know how we're going to privatize them because no one's interested in those toxic assets. I don't know how we're going to take care of the welfare issue, because you cut people's welfare, you're going to look at mass violence. If you, the administration is deadlocked with union reps who are necessary for the power of the ruling party. So I mean, we tried to do only a 4% increase this last fiscal year on government wages, and they couldn't make that. They had to make it a 7% increase. Now, a 4% increase is in nominal terms, so that's below inflation, which is practically speaking a 3% cut. So they managed to just strike and demand the government keep pace with inflation. And to just keep pace with inflation, that is actually costing the government enough in the long run that we will have to default by the end of the decade. If you just look at the figures and you just keep the current trends going, we're going to have to default at the end of the decade, and that's just going to be absolute nightmare for cost of living. Rand will go through the floor, things like that. So yeah, now South Africa is heading for a really nasty doom scenario, and like no one really has a plan. I mean, you look at the DA, and I can't imagine that they have the stones required to just liquefy like a third of the government. Like, how are they going to get that done? Are you going to come out with sort of shambooks and attack dogs when the unions start striking? What are you going to do when they start assassinating people? Like, do you have control over the security forces? No, you don't. You're sitting on a machine that the ANC's built.
Just to add to that, Rob, to add to the economic trends that we're seeing, you touched on it before we started discussing the unemployment rate, but there's a massive, not just migration of population to the Western Cape, both black and white, but there's also, and you mentioned it, the economic boom that's going, where people are moving their businesses there, people are building massive offices there, people are moving their entire industries there. What implications does this have for the Cape going forward, and any dreams of autonomy or independence?
Well, I mean, one of the interesting things that's overlooked is we actually have our own stock exchange here. So the Cape Town Stock Exchange, I mean, it's small. I mean, like, let's not kid ourselves. It's not a huge thing, but
it exists.
It exists. There. I mean, that's what you need. It exists, which means that you have a way. Let's say Cape Independence is coming, and you're like a big company in South Africa. You can be pretty much guaranteed that, like, once the Cape breaks away, there's going to be a period of adjustment where things are still very porous. There aren't any sort of hard sanctions or anything. Things are still being negotiated and worked out. You'd want to like move all of your capital over to the Western Cape. You stick it in the stock exchange. You stick it in you'd sort of move your addresses down to the Cape in order to shield yourself from any weird stuff like currency collapse or government seizures. Because, I mean, one of the big things that partnership with China opens up is the possibility for mass nationalization of industry and property. Because you can do that, and then you can subcontract running it to the Chinese. So you end up sort of like voluntarily getting colonized. But for everyone who's sort of already in the country, what that's going to practically look like is everything's confiscated. So
just the rolling blackout hitting me there, but I've still got power here. You can continue, Rob. Just some context, because there might have been a weird flash on my side of the screen.
Oh yeah. I think people are used to it now. I mean, being the environmentalist leaders that we are, leaders.
It's the price we need. It's a small price to pay, Rob, for salvation.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing that makes me very sad is when you look at this. It's like, well, anyone from outside South Africa, yeah, well, life's going on in South Africa, so we don't actually need 24 hours of electricity, do we? And it's one of those sort of sinister things where, what are people willing to tolerate without a revolution?
All right, Rob, I think with that little message there from the government through their failure, I think that's an indication that I have to get to my last question, and that's a lot of people have been asking this in the chat in some form, so I'm going to be condensing it into one question, and that is, how is Cape independence coming along? What's on the horizon? What's being achieved? What is there to be looking out for?
Okay, well, look, so far we've managed to build a sort of broad base of popular support. Again, one has to take it with a pinch of salt, because it's still, I mean, it's not like we're mobilizing masses of people to like occupy buildings and stuff. It's sort of just sentiment based, so that's soft. It can change, but I think it represents sort of a very, very deep seated, fed upness with the rest of the country. And it also, the longer it goes on, the deeper that commitment becomes. I remember I mentioned at the head of this episode, there's a consciousness shift that comes with identifying with the independence movement. So, I mean, look, but I wouldn't say that you can be confident that it'll never happen. I mean, at this stage, I think it's safe to say it's about 50-50. So the way it will happen, if it happens at the moment, the sort of timeline that's been worked out by Phil Craig, who, kudos to him, enormous as someone who's wielding as little institutional power as he is, he's really moving things. So at the moment, the thing is, the big advantage for us is that the ANC signed on to a whole bunch of treaties in the 90s where they have to recognize local autonomy of peoples that want it. And so one of the big boxes that is to be ticked is something that's going to hit the legislative floor this year, which is the Western Cape People's Bill. What that does is it says, we, the Western Cape, are our own people with our own sort of political and national desires, and we deserve to be recognized as such. Second, we've done that. We've basically fulfilled the requirements of the treaty for the ANC to devolve government power down to us. And it actually takes precedent over a lot of constitutional considerations, because there are articles in the Constitution which force recognition of international law. And so, yeah, once that's done, it's sort of, if the DA has the balls for it, which I hope they really do. Although I hear they're trying to, they might work against this for stupid reasons. If they're smart, they'll take advantage of this and say, okay, look, we want all of these powers back. We're just going to start our own institutions. Come and sue us. So then the Western Cape just sort of builds their own railways, builds their own sort of port infrastructure, what have you. Expands the LEAP offices to be a parallel policing system, and you just dare the central government to do something. And yeah, that'll move ahead really well. So once you got that ball rolling, the next move is asking for federal devolution at the parliamentary level. You don't have to get a yes. The point is to get a no, because you're moving towards something called remedial secession. And this is about international law stuff. So if you want to get recognized by the international community, which is a shorthand for all the Western countries that are occupied by the United States, if you want to get recognized by those guys, you have to tick a whole bunch of boxes, because they don't like risk, they don't like sort of funny shit. So you make sure that you're rejected by all the institutions from Pretoria, that they say no to all of your efforts for devolution. And then you take advantage of the constitutional provision that allows premiers to hold their own referendums. You have your referendum. Even if the IEC says no, just do it. It doesn't require, because the thing about independence is you're asserting your own authority. So if you defer to the central government, like what happened in Catalonia, they won their little referendum, and then the president, I think he's called Piedmont or something like that, he went and said, "Oh, great!" So he addresses this huge ecstatic crowd, and then he and then everything turned sour when he said, "And now we have to ask permission from the Spanish central government." And the second they did that, it's like all of the confidence collapsed, everything went chaotic, and the Spanish government said, "No, you're not leaving." So the trick to this is very simple. You just sort of assert your authority consistently. And once you've got that, I mean, look, chances are we're going to win. The research by a number of people, both from people I'm listening to, it's not only internal DA research, but also what's it called? France Crenier. They've all done research that shows that Cape Independence actually would win a referendum. So that's not really the issue. The issue is getting the DA to actually want what's being offered to them on a platter, which is being demanded by most of their supporters. When people, the other issue that we have to worry about, and I think it is legitimate, is that the ANC don't want to let us go. The problem with that is that they're not actually capable of stopping us. So if you want to look at military capacity, it's very poor. If you want to look at a really good exercise of South African military capacity today, you look at the riots 2 years ago in KwaZulu-Natal. They stood back, let the riots burn themselves out. Then they show up as peacekeeping force, and they run out of food and water after a week and a couple of days. And this is like in the middle of a city. They can't even they can't even source stuff by looking through the yellow pages. It's that level of stupidity. So they can't occupy the Cape using any conventional military force. And if they do, we can, we've got this huge private security infrastructure available to us that's easy to mobilize. Relatively, I should say relatively, not like it's waving a magic wand, but it's doable. So it's not going to be a problem to deal with a conventional military force. The problem is that there is sort of sabotage, terrorism, that kind of stuff. So, I mean, that's also something you can deal with, because the second that kind of stuff happens, immediately you have a massive public mandate for stopping it. You have you get a massive mandate to do extraordinary use of executive power as a now de facto independent country, and so all of this boils down to whether or not people in the DA have the will to act in the interests and desires of the majority of the Western Cape, and that's not that is yet to be sort of seen. I mean, one of the big things I think we ought to remember is, actually, it's not public knowledge, but small little note to end the interview on. So the DA has been losing support. They are likely to go below 50% in the province in the next election, and they'll be forced to make a coalition deal with probably the Vryheidsfront Plus, who are a pro-independence party. The thing about this is, the reason they're losing support, and if you follow all the by-elections and you notice where it is, it's all in like parts of like the north and the northeast of the province. Those areas are voting for these new coloured nationalist parties and local parties. So Gayton McKenzie and that lot. And one thing I noticed about those areas, and I was researching something completely different. I was looking up the blue and green drop water standards in the province. And it turns out that outside of these sort of safe zones in like the city and Drakenstein and a few places around here, you start to see the quality of the water drops off so dramatically in those areas, like Barrydale particularly. Those are areas where the quality of the water is at the level of some of the worst ANC-run municipalities. So what the DA has been doing is they've been neglecting marginal municipalities in the Western Cape because they take our votes for granted, particularly coloured areas. And the result is that they're getting fed up with the DA and voting for other people. And yeah, this is going to bite them in the bum. And I think that they're in for a shock in 2024. So there's a likelihood that they'll be pushed for something like either they'll be pushed for independence, or or they're just going to flounder and become another MDC, like Zimbabwe's opposition party. I don't see them winning long term.
Thank you very much for your insights here tonight. I think the Cape is definitely part of the world that people in South Africa are keeping an eye on. But I think South Africa, or Southern Africa as a whole, is also being looked at very closely for different reasons by different factions all across the world. Thank you. If people want to check out your work, there is a link to your Substack and to your Twitter and to your YouTube channel, all in the description. So I took the liberty of putting that in there. You don't have to show any of your content. Everything is in the description if you are unaware of Rob's content. And then if you're new to this channel, you can subscribe. And if you like this type of conversation, you can like. And if you're not watching live, you can still take part in the conversation and share your thoughts in the comment section. I read all of them, respond to as many as I can. All right, guys, thank you for tuning in. Thank you for your questions and for your comments. Really appreciate the great interaction here from the chat side. And I hope you all have an excellent evening, great week. And Rob, all the best to you in the week ahead and the year ahead as well.
All right. Thanks very much, man.
All right. Cheers, guys. Have a good one, and God bless.